All right. Thanks, everybody. I want to talk today about 1894 and after. We talked about the progressives quite a bit, right? We've talked about the various views of the progressives, that they are the old middle class, or the new middle class, they're the bourgeoisie, the sort of upper class. I don't, and my own sense that if we want to talk about the progressive movement, it's more complicated than that, and that there are some roots of the populist movement that go into the progressive movement. That's what I have wanted to suggest, as well as some parts of the labor movement that go into the progressive movement. So I want to talk today about the kind of fruits of this long progressive movement after 1894, after the Depression of 1893, this railway strikes in 1894, sort of what happens to the old populist party and the ways in which the so-called progressives burrow their way into both the Democratic and the Republican Party. Okay, so after 1893, which is a serious financial crisis, there's a serious problem with money, right? Where is the U.S. going to get its treasury support? And previously, it had relied not exclusively, but very, very much on the sugar tariff, because there was so much sugar flowing into the United States from sugar, and so much sugar that was needed to produce many of the products that are being exported by the United States, especially canned foods and things like that. So sugar is crucial. And the question is sort of, what do we do now? Do we just reimpose this tax on sugar? The Democrats and the Republicans are sort of divided about it. Remember that the 1894 was the great upheaval where we see this drastic move to the Republican Party, many more Republicans in power. So in 1894, the democratically controlled, sorry, wait a second, 94, 96, right? 1896 was the surge of Republicans. But 1894, the democratically controlled House and Senate passed an income tax. But this was overturned in 1894 in a legal case, Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust, which basically said you can't have an income tax. The explanation for this, the reason why the Supreme Court said this, was because they said it was basically sectional legislation, that if you impose an income tax, it wasn't equally organized among the states. So if you impose an income tax on incomes of over, say, $10,000 a year, this would mean that New York, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania would basically provide 80% of the taxes that would come into the United States at that point. And that wasn't really fair. So southern, western states were basically supporting an income tax which would largely not which would benefit themselves, but at the expense of New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, where most of the folks with lots of income are, at least in the 1890s. So in northern cities, though, populist Democrats found deep roots in the immigrant working men's movements. And the best example of this, I think, is in Chicago. This is Anton Cermak. Tony Cermak, as he was called. He lived through the Pullman strike and the Chicago conflagration in Chicago. And populists like Cermak, in the wake of this, become what are called Reform Democrats. And Reform Democrats is a kind of a funny term. These Reform Democrats do support things like factory legislation and stuff like that. And they're different kinds of Democrats, and the Democratic Party had been very, very strongly Catholic, right? Irish Catholics and other Catholics had been a big part of the Democratic Party. What Cermak does, interestingly, he's born in Kladno in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is now the Czech Republic. He's basically Czech. And he decides that there ought to be representation for people who are not just Irish. So you'd get some workers who would vote for the Democratic Party, but it was always the Irish people that were put ahead. And Cermak really pushed for a kind of weird interesting coalitions of workers in Chicago to support the Democratic Party. He would support, for example, a mixed ticket of a German and a Hungarian, or a Pole and a Czech, and persuade these immigrant workers that they needed to support this sort of insurgent reform Democrats at the expense of the old-fashioned Irish Democratic Party. Now, to say that, that said, he's definitely trying to expand the base of the Democratic Party, make it more of a workers' party. That said, this is perhaps one of the most corrupt politicians of the late 19th century. He becomes a millionaire basically through various forms of graft connected with the Democratic Party, becomes a multimillionaire, in fact. So I don't want to give you the sense that this Reform Democrat is all about helping workers and things like that. That's true. That's why he comes to power. But he makes himself quite a bit of money in the midst of this. He's first in the Illinois House of Representatives, and he's a big supporter of Chicago's power. Chicago, weirdly, is the most populous city in the state of Illinois, and Cook County, which is this area surrounding Chicago, is massive. But for complicated constitutional reasons, Chicago has almost no power in Illinois. And so Cermak is a big supporter of strengthening Chicago in relation to Illinois. You couldn't have a license to sell popcorn in Chicago without first going to the state legislature in Springfield, Springfield, Illinois, to get legislation passed that would allow a person to open a popcorn stand in downtown Chicago. Bowling alleys, all these other sorts of things. The state basically had extremely strong control over the city. And so Cermak tries to sort of wrest some power from them. He is one of the first of these sort of Reform Democrats. Another person who's critical to the Reform Democrats is this colorful character named J. Hamilton Lewis. If you've seen the Umbrella Academy, I'm fairly certain that J. Ham Lewis is the one of the inspirations for the Umbrella Academy. He always had an umbrella. He often had a monocle, and he always dressed in this sort of dapper way. So this was J. Hamilton Lewis, J. Ham Lewis, and he's an interesting person. He's trim. He's got a toupee. He's a redheaded son of a prominent Virginia family that moved from Georgia to Washington Territory in the 1880s. Oh, okay. So the minority whip, he's the first person to be a minority whip. And the minority whip is like, so say the Democrats are in the minority. The minority whip is the person who basically ensures that everybody lines up in support of the party. So basically, that's where all the backroom dealings happen. He's the first whip ever. First minority whip ever. There had been previously majority whips, but minority whips are basically saying to Democrats or any minority in the party that's in the minority, all right, we want to support this legislation, say a federal income tax. What does your state need to get it done? And so he would have individual voting inside the party to see which direction the party was going. He'd try to whip those people into, so a little bit like a coordinator. If you actually really want to know what's happening in Congress, paying attention to the congressional record makes no sense. The whip counts are actually the most important thing. There's a social scientist at William & Mary, where I used to be, who studied whip counts, and he said that whip counts told you actually where people in Congress were on various things. So the minority whip is basically, a coordinator for the party. He kind of runs the party in a way that the president no longer does. So that's what the whip is. So he becomes the longest-lived standard bearer for the Reform Democrats. He started in the West. He comes from Georgia, but he moves to Washington Territory in the 1880s, where he briefly and unhappily works as the counsel for the Northern Pacific Railroad. And he decides he hates the Northern Pacific Railroad after he finishes it. He soon embraced the entire populist cause, but in the name of the Democratic Party. And from his days as a corporate lawyer, he retained his pin-perfect tailored clothing, erect bearings, spats, and trademark umbrella. A congressman from the Washington Territory elected to the House in 1896, he demanded municipal ownership of utilities, factory inspection, home inspection, and the 8-hour workday. And all these things were opposed supported in Washington and in the state of Washington, but otherwise opposed by two groups, the groups that controlled them, the Bourbon Democrats they were called, which is the majority of the Democrats. The Bourbon are the sort of old-fashioned Southern Democrats primarily, who supported this sort of control of just a tiny number of people, and what were called the Old Guard Republicans. And so in Congress, you've got this parties that are composed mostly of Bourbon Democrats on the one hand and mostly Old Guard Republicans on the other. There are a few other independent Republicans and things like that, a few other independent Democrats, but that's mostly who they are. And both of them hate everything that Hamilton Lewis stands for. They hate municipal ownership of utilities for different reasons. They hate factory inspection. They hate home inspection. They hate the 8-hour workday. So Lewis in 1901 decides to move to Chicago. He says that Chicago is the center for this democratic reform. He becomes a close friend of Cermak's, and he becomes attracted to the sort of populist-inspired municipal and state reforms proposed after the 1894 strike and the conflagration that happened in Chicago and the burning of the city and part of the city and stuff like that. He relocates in 1903 to create the Reform Democrats to build a stable, strong party structure committed to genuinely populist principles. 10 years later, he would represent the state as senator and become the first Democratic whip. So what else does the Democratic Party do? Well, it's interesting. Here, the Democratic Party also, in Chicago, reaches out to black voters. Traditionally, black voters had been Republicans, right? The Republicans had been the party of Lincoln. But some of the Reform Democrats believe that they can get the support of black voters because black voters are going to support things like municipal ownership of utilities or factory inspection or something like that. It's not very successful, but they do attempt to sort of reach out and make the Democratic Party something that's slightly different than it had been in the past. Okay, so that's the Reform Democrats. On the other side, there's the Reform Republicans, the progressive Republicans. And that's people like this guy, Robert Lafollette, called Fighting Bob Lafollette. He was a representative from Wisconsin from 1885 to 1891. And, let me just say one more thing about Ham Lewis. Ham Lewis is the person who, in FDR's first run for president, or in the case where FDR is running, he's the one who calls for a New Deal for America. So he's actually one who coins the term New Deal, and FDR borrows it in 1933 from him, but it's Lewis that kind of comes up with it. So Bob Lafollette, in Republican stronghold states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Kansas, and Iowa, populists formed a seabed of an important insurgent movement inside the Republican Party. These Republican reformers borrowed many organizing strategies from the populists, although as we saw, there were very few populists in Wisconsin or Michigan. There were plenty in Kansas and Iowa. These reformers took advantage of the convulsion of 1893 and the Republican avalanche of 1894 to burrow through the Republican Party from within. Especially at the state level, these Reform Republicans created what they called the Wisconsin ideal. They broke up the old Republican caucus and party structure that had returned old guard Republicans again and again to the House and Senate. So inside the party, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, you have these Reform Democrats who are sort of inspired by the populists who are fighting back against the Democratic Party. And then you have the Reform Republicans who are fighting against the old guard Republicans who had dominated the party before them. So these are both composed primarily, I suppose, of youngish men in the 19-teens or so who are tired of old line party politics, and they end up joining hands and basically supporting progressive legislation that's sponsored by both Republicans and Democrats. And so this progressive movement then in Congress anyways is one that's supported by both Republicans and Democrats. Now, we're used to Republicans and Democrats hating each other, in the last, say, dozen years or so, not talking to each other at all. But this is really the height, sort of 1894 to the 1920s. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. The Wisconsin ideal. But the 1880s to 1920s, this is really the height of kind of unity among Republicans and Democrats. Let's see, the Wisconsin ideal. Bear with me for a second. Yeah, so what's the Wisconsin ideal? First of all, it's binding arbitration in strikes. So if there's a strike that's likely to lead to chaos, like the 1894 strike, then the Wisconsin folks believed that outside professionals should be brought in and communicate with both the strikers and management. And yeah, they're right. The avalanche of 1894 did see a regional move, and yeah, we start to see Democrats in the North, and we don't yet see Republicans in the North. We see Democrats and Republicans in the North in a way that they'd never been before. So the Wisconsin ideal, number one, is binding arbitration and strikes. So basically, we don't like strikes. We don't think that there should be the chaos, so we think that there should be private folks that should be brought in to resolve. And the other thing in the Wisconsin ideal is nonpartisan review of state functions. So there should be committees of experts that should come in and inspect the way that water, for example, is delivered into Chicago, and they should make recommendations, and they should be binding recommendations. No, both the Bourbon and the Democrats, Reform Democrats, oppose tariffs. So that's one thing that the old Bourbon Democrats and the new Reform Democrats agreed on, is that there should be tariffs for basically for income only. So they recognize that the tariff is really the primary way in which you're going to get money, but they don't believe that they believe that if there's a surplus, that the tariff should be lowered, and that's evidence that you can't have no tariff at all, much to the Democrats' chagrin, because there has to be some way that money has to be generated for the federal government, and selling land is less and less important. And as I said, the Pollock v. Farmers Loan had made income tax an impossible method. So back to Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust, the Supreme Court had said, no, you can't have an income tax. So, but yeah, the Reform Democrats and the Bourbon Democrats both are low tariff folks. And the Republicans, while they support these new Republicans, the Wisconsin Ideal Republicans, while they do support the sort of role of private experts in strikes and in reform and things like that, they're also generally pretty positive about the tariff. So there's Republicans still on the crucial matters for they support tariffs, but they're reformers in lots of other methods. Okay, that's a little bit about this. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the results of the 1893 Depression and the 1894 strike. And that's there's some important issues that emerged. Let me go ahead first here too. These are unemployed workers in 1893, and what we see here is that the terms tramp and bum emerge in this period, and they become the symbol of everyman for novelists. But there are a lot of people who are traveling the highways, and there are a couple of novels that capture this sort of life. One of them is Robert Herrick's Memoirs of an American Citizen, which comes out in 1905, which describes the dangers of the city from a tramp's eye view. The tramp is a shabby-looking man who enters the city, and he sees the city differently. He sees how dangerous the city is. And even though he has no job, even though he has nothing, he understands better the problems of the city. That's Memoirs of an American Citizen. Sheldon's In His Steps is one of the best-selling novels ever. You've never heard of it, probably, but you have probably heard the expression that came out of it, what would Jesus do? And that's a direct result of this novel in his steps. A former printer thrown out of employment by a linotype machine, Sheldon's tramp asks difficult questions of Henry Maxwell's congregation when he visits Maxwell's church. He said, "I've tramped through this city for 3 years trying to find a job, and all that time I've had not a word of sympathy or comfort except from your minister here." He compares his own wandering for work with the wandering of Jesus, and he said, "What do Christians mean by following the steps of Jesus? I see the ragged edge of things. I understand that there are more than 500 men in this city, in my case. Most of them have families. My wife died 4 months ago. I'm glad she's out of trouble. My little girl is staying with a printer's family until I found a job. Somehow I get puzzled when I see so many Christians living in luxury and singing, 'Jesus, I my cross have taken, all to leave and follow thee,' and remember how my wife died in a tenement in New York, gasping for air and asking God to take the little girl too." So the difficult question of the shabby-looking man who dies shortly afterwards forces the preacher to ask himself, what would Jesus do? And the wanderer's question then sends the preacher to wander the country too. Yeah, it's written in, it's actually a little bit after that. Yeah, I want to say it's around 1905. It's after the 1894, we can quickly look it up, but it's after the 1894 downturn, 1893 downturn that this novel comes out. And so the wanderers, then this minister forces people to decide, what would Jesus do? And they persuades a newspaper editor to not advertise a brutal prize fight. Manager decides to make his workplace more livable, and a monopolist to risk his job by handing information over to the Interstate Commerce Commission. So this is a kind of romanticizing of the plight. 1896, excellent, thank you, Chris. It's a sort of romanticizing of the plight of the tramp, but also the emergence of a kind of Christian reform movement that's also an important part of the progressive movement. And many others, of course, recognized that it was hardly romantic to wander the country searching for work, as many people did in 1894. Another kind of cultural result of this is Harry Haywire McClintock creates a song shortly after 1893, which is a song of caution about tramping, about being a tramp. He says since the 1890s, jockers, as they were called, or older hobos, would try to lure uprooted young men into their lairs with stories about the open road. But he in his song, "The Lemonade Springs Where the Bluebird Sings," were not actually to be found, McClintock sang. Instead, as the older and bawdier version, and so this is of the Big Rock Candy Mountain. This is the song that comes out after 1894. The Big Rock Candy Mountain with all these lemonade springs and the bluebird sings and all the beautiful things. That's according to McClintock, the person who writes the song, about what older hobos would promise to younger hobos. And in the original version of the song, the boy was likely to, after having hiked till my feet are sore, to end up, quote, "buggered sore like a hobo's whore in the Big Rock Candy Mountain." The open road was dangerous, and that was the sort of moral of the McClintock song is that don't listen to the stories about the Big Rock Candy Mountain because you're likely to be abused. Another important result of 1893, outside of Congress, is a shift in the organization of corporate America. John D. Rockefeller paved the way in the 1880s when he created one of the first trusts, but after trusts proved increasingly unworkable, trust-like organizations used the loose incorporation laws of the New Jersey legislature to consolidate into corporate monopolies. Rockefeller had shown that manufacturers could maintain their separate manufacturing facilities. Competing manufacturers could maintain their separate manufacturing facilities that had grown up in competition while establishing a single institution for marketing and sales. A New York City headquarters would set prices, divide up markets, and punish competitors. Consumers learned to their chagrin that monopoly corporations establish a uniformly high rate for goods sold in the United States and competitively low rates for goods they sold abroad, especially in Central and South America. Monopolists in sugar, oil, steel, and even matchstick manufacture also learned from Rockefeller that a properly formed monopoly or oligopoly could bypass banks altogether and go directly to the capital markets on the New York Stock Exchange. And so New York Stock Exchange goes from being a place that's just mostly, it's primarily railroad stocks and state bonds and things like that, to being business bonds. And so it's really after 1893, the Depression of 1893, the creation of these monopolies, that you get industrial stocks that are available in a regular way. U.S. Steel had been on the market for a while, but you see U.S. Sugar, the Lumber Trust, the Steel Trust, the Sugar Trust, the Wool Trust, and the Matchstick Trust, all emerge in this period. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which emerges also in this time, is basically the top 10 trusts. It's the average of the stock price of the top 10 or 15 or 20 trusts. And it's not until really the 19 teens or so that we start to see competitive industries. But many of these private industries, many of these trusts emerge after 1893. It becomes a way of consolidating a national corporation, ensuring a monopoly, and New York becomes a much more important institution than it had been previously, because that's where the law offices are, that's where the stock is issued, that's where bonds are issued and things like that for these trusts. And you see that these folks are increasingly drawn together. This is where the term interlocking directorate is used to describe this relationship between the trusts and banks, because they increasingly get close to banks and then sort of share board members with the banks that sponsor them and things like that. So we get a much more kind of consolidated trusts, and a very different kind of capitalist, not somebody who's much interested in competing on a national market, but making sure that there's a kind of national monopoly. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 had originally threatened to break apart these cartels, but in 1895, in United States versus E.C. Knight, that the Supreme Court declared that a cartel formed by manufacturers was not a restraint of trade. That's the great. Anyways, and it was not, because the Antitrust Act had been designed only to stop collusion between interstate merchants, and so a sugar trust was not a restraint of trade. A steel trust was not a restraint of trade, because there's no trading involved. That was so manufacturing and transportation were local affairs that only the states could regulate, the court decided. So states could intervene in trusts, but not anyone else. And that's why New Jersey becomes the key place for the organization of these companies, and New York becomes the key place for the operation of these companies, is because New Jersey basically says we're not going to enforce any trust regulation. After that 1895 decision, then, J.P. Morgan emerges to begin to reorganize about 60 competing railroads into 7 major corporations with regional monopolies over particular corridors. Alabama to Chicago, Chicago to California, Atlanta to Richmond, Alabama to Chicago, or Seattle to Kansas City. And it's called Morganization. So we go from over 60 major competing railroads, or hundreds of railroads, but there are 60 major competing railroads, and all of them under Morgan are consolidated into 7. And he's able to do this by sort of creating these cartels, buying up the railroads, consolidating them, and selling the stocks in these railroads, particularly in Europe. So Europeans buy these monopoly railway corridors because they understand that the price is going to, that they're going to be able to charge monopoly prices, and they're going to be more important. So Morganization of a railroad system is a result of the 1893 panic as well. Only by 1911, with the Supreme Court's breakup of Standard Oil, would the court take antitrust seriously again. And then the Federal Trade Commission, created in 1913, would actually be, or 1914, would be in a position to actually break up trusts. But the Supreme Court in 1911 established what's called a rule of reason, which applies that if a restraint of trade is obvious and egregious, as it was in the case of Standard Oil, that it could be broken up. Okay, so why do I have a bar room here? There was some reason why I had a bar room there. I think it's about sugar, but I want to talk now about what happens in Cuba. The Democratic tariff on sugar that was imposed, the Wilson-Gorman tariff of 1894, reimposed the tariff on raw sugar and shrunk the bounty on local sugar. So basically, the tariff on raw sugar was eliminated, and tariff on refined sugar remains. But the tariff on raw sugar was a big part of the bigger tariff. And the Democrats hoped that this tariff on raw sugar would draw in about $40 million a year in revenue. It doesn't quite do that, but it does draw in more revenue. Hawaii, which is still independent but not yet an American territory, was exempt from the tariff, and it quickly recovered after the Wilson-Gorman tariff. However, the Wilson-Gorman tariff walloped Cuba, causing Cuban sugar exports to America to decline by 50% in 1895. The reimposition of the tariffs by the Democrats led to basically not just a depression, not just a recession, but a massive depression in Cuba in 1895. As prices fell and plantations cut wages, revolutionary movements in the Cuban countryside quickly emerged, including the bombing of Cuban train stations. Spain's brutal attempt to put down the Cuban Revolution led to nearly 100,000 fatalities. Yeah, so antitrust legislation was left to the states basically from the E.C. Knight decision in 1895 until 1911. Yeah, so the tariff on raw sugar is reinstated right at the end of 1894, beginning of 1895, and what it does is wallops Cuba big time. We actually still don't know what happened in the Cuban Revolution because Spain has still not released any of the internal records of Cuba in this period. There were reconcentration camps in Cuba to try to move settlers. There were at least 100,000 deaths, but we'll not ever know for sure. Probably Cuba's, I guess, even though it's gone through multiple changes in, Spain, even though it's gone through multiple changes in government since then, still believes that it's too sensitive to release any of the information about what was done with the Cuban rebels in 1895. So remember that Cuba is a Spanish colony at this point. So the conflict led and this is going to be familiar if you remember Hawaii, the large Cuban plantation owners to appeal to the United States for invasion and annexation. Many of the largest Cuban plantation owners were actually living in the United States at the time. Continued appeals for an American intervention in Cuba came from a bizarre coalition of sugar refiners who wanted to be able to get the raw sugar cheap again, American imperialists, journalists who wanted, the U.S. to flex its muscles or something like that and demonstrate that it could be just as powerful as any European state, and then humanitarians who were appalled by the death of so many Cubans. So it's a bizarre combination. So adjusting a tariff on sugar had caused a revolution in Hawaii, number one, a depression in the United States, number two, a railroad strike in the Midwest, number three, and finally a revolution and then a war in Cuba. And we're going to talk about the Spanish-American War over the control of Cuba and ultimately of the Philippines later on. But this is the kind of final result of the adjustment of these tariffs. You eliminate the raw sugar, Hawaii has a revolution, and lots of... Right. The answer to this is don't mess with the sugar. In fact, this is probably too much information, but the sugar tariff is actually still hotly contested, and the Batista family and other families that own lots of sugar now in Florida are tremendously powerful in the United States. Okay. Now, the U.S. though, Cuba became an American protectorate. I'll talk about the Cuban War later. Hawaii became a territory, and once Cuba becomes a protectorate after the Cuban-American War, the Spanish-American War, which I'll talk about later, it becomes a protectorate. And when it becomes a protectorate, it's also exempt from the tariff, right? So what happens is that there's no money for this to support the federal government anymore. They had tried to use an income tax to find, some way of providing revenue, but the federal government was still operating in a deficit and was now massively in the red because of a war against Spain in 1898, and it still needed to fix something to tax. In 1895, it tried to use an income tax, but it was declared illegal. So the simple answer in 1898 is to impose a tax on beer. And the 1898 War Revenue Act doubles. Yeah, not exactly. Yeah, that's interesting. I actually didn't know that about Puerto Rico. I'm still having trouble kind of understanding Puerto Rico's place in this. But yeah, Cuba becomes a protectorate, and it's basically like a part of the American Empire. We'll talk a little bit about how that happens. Puerto Rico later is also going to be part of the American Empire, so they're going to be supposedly have partial control, but supposedly not full sovereignty. That's what happens in both. Eventually, is going to happen in Cuba and also the Philippines in 1899. But this war with Cuba, the fact that there's no source of revenue anymore is produces the War Revenue Act. Beer and tobacco prices are doubled. Bowling alleys are taxed. Bankers are taxed. Who else is taxed? There's special taxes imposed on people who sell stock. There's a stamp tax on all financial transactions. The oil and sugar trusts, because they basically monopolize oil and sugar, they are taxed directly. There's a special oil and sugar tax for them that's imposed. The other thing, frantically looking around for ideas to try to find something to tax, because now not only do they have this budget deficit, but they have this war that's costing more and more money, is they impose an 1898. There's a theme there. It's definitely a tax on vices. And so banking was considered a vice. Bowling alleys are considered a vice. Bars are considered a vice. There's not a national bar tax, but there are a lot of taxes on things like that. Circuses. There's a tax on circuses in 1898. Basically things that people recognize were sin taxes. It's basically a series of sin taxes, including the sin of monopoly. In 1898, there's also a national estate tax, and this is really the first tax on estates of people who die in the United States. A percentage of the income of people who die goes to the federal government, and that's initially designed to sort of basically have some other source of revenue, because now that Hawaii and Cuba, both of which had been, the taxes on the sugar going into them had been paying for the U.S.'s bills, now there was something else needed to be done. So all right. So that's we'll talk about the Spanish-American War in Cuba and things like that. Are there other questions? I feel like I've been rushing through this, but this is the final result of this sort of. Let me just conclude by talking a little bit about the progressives. So the progressive movement is never a party. The progressive movement is a group of reformers in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party who oppose some of the old ways of operation by the sort of predecessors. The Republican progressives are uncomfortable with the old guard progressives, and they want federal regulation. They want binding arbitration and strikes. They want outside investigators and municipal reform and things like that. The Reform Democrats want wage legislation. They want 8-hour day. They want these other sorts of things. And basically, across the aisle, these progressives kind of join hands and pass legislation together. And it's going to take a while for it to happen. It's going to take another crash in 1907 for it to happen. But what happens after 1907 is the Democrats and Republicans reach across the aisle and create a whole series of things that was proposed by Woodrow Wilson in what's called the New Freedom. Number one is lowering tariffs. Oh, why couldn't they just bring back? Yeah, well, the thing about why couldn't they bring back the sugar tax is now all the raw sugar that's coming in from the United States is coming from the United States. All the raw sugar that's coming into the United States is coming from basically two places, Hawaii and Cuba. They have been taxing that before, but they can't tax it anymore because they're now both part of the United States. Basically both protectorates in this period. So they're both part of the United States, and you can't tax something in the United States going from one part of the United States to another part of the United States. Does that make sense? So it would have been smart to reimpose the tax on sugar, but they couldn't do it anymore because first Hawaii and then Cuba go into revolutions, and then the United States basically absorbs them in a series of conflicts, a very brief conflict in Hawaii and a somewhat longer conflict, the Spanish-American War in Cuba. So that's basically the reason that sugar tax is not ever going to work anymore, is because now most of the raw sugar that's coming in the United States is coming from the United States. And so what they do is Woodrow Wilson proposes it, and it's finally passed. And there's three things: a lowering of tariffs in 1913, which the Democrats strongly support, and the Republican progressives are willing to go along with. Number two is the creation of a Federal Trade Commission in 1914, which is going to be an antitrust organization. And using the guidance from the 1911 Supreme Court decision on the breakup of Standard Oil, they're going to make a decision, just like as a series of experts, about whether there really is a trust or not. That's why the Federal Trade Commission is really a kind of Republican reform. It's that Republican Wisconsin ideal. You have outside experts look at the thing and you say, is there a restraint of trade here? If there is a restraint of trade, then the trust goes away. This, I think I've said this before, this is a very American response to trusts, is not to argue that little guys are being hurt, because little guys being hurt is basically not a thing in U.S. Jurisprudence. But restraint of trade, if there's evidence that the price is sort of continually going up and there's an issue, then restraint of trade kind of clicks in, and it can be broken up. So that's what happens to AT&T. That's what happens to a couple of airlines. It's what happens to what else? A bunch of other interests. And Google is now being tried cases being brought by the Federal Trade Commission against Google for restraint of trade in that context. So you get the Federal Trade Commission, which is a kind of Republican flavored, I guess, progressivism. Something that both the Democrats and the Republicans favor is ultimately some sort of reserve system, and weirdly, the old populist idea of providing credits for cotton and wheat that's that's in elevators or in storage, providing the basis for loans and things like that. The Federal Reserve sort of becomes that. It's a Federal Reserve Bank is created, but it has 12 branches, which are each control different regions. And there's one in Atlanta, for example. There's one in St. Louis. And this Federal Reserve System is designed to be a kind of decentralized, quasi-populist thing, although it's very strongly favored by the very large banks who like the idea of a kind of being able to have direct access to credit. I'm going to talk a little bit about Jekyll Island and the creation of the Federal Reserve later. And the third thing, and connected with that is the Federal Farm Loan Act, which provides massive farm loans to workers. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Jekyll Island. Okay. Yeah. So I'll talk about Jekyll Island and the secrets of Jekyll Island and the creation of the Federal Reserve and all the conspiracy theories. You would not believe all the conspiracy theories about Jekyll Island. But anyways, so constitutional changes pushed by those are the three major parts of the New Freedom. The other things are two constitutional changes, which have drastic and long-term importance. Right. Number one is the income tax. It's initially, so basically the progressives say, we can't get the Supreme Court to agree to income taxes. So our only solution is to come up with legislation. And so Congress comes up with legislation, and then it goes as a constitutional amendment, and then they send it out to the states. It takes, 4 years for the income tax in the 16th Amendment to emerge. But basically what the income tax legislation does is to replace tariffs and replace sugar. So it's a replace sugar. That's basically gone forever. And a huge portion of where the federal government was getting its money, that's gone forever because Hawaii and Cuba are now both effectively inside the United States. But once you establish an income tax in 1913, then you can replace tariffs. Then you can start to lower tariffs because the tariffs had been the primary support for the federal government previously. Does that make sense? So it's not just free trade versus tariffs. That's important. But it's also where the U.S. government is going to get its revenue. The income tax becomes the solution to that problem. Number two, the 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators, that passes more quickly. It's passed by Congress and then goes around to the states and is also ratified in 1913 as the 17th Amendment. What this does is break down the old power structure that I talked about before with Senator Aldrich. Remember? Previously, senators were chosen by states. So the state legislatures would come together and choose the senators. And what that did was it made the party machine much, much more powerful because you got people who basically didn't have to go to voters to get their support. They had to be basically powerful and important people inside the machine. So that's how Nelson Aldrich, who is from Rhode Island, the smallest state in the Union, effectively controlling all of the tariffs for the entire country, partly because the president is relatively underpowered, partly because of the way that the committee structure works that holds people in power. And so basically Nelson Aldrich is, in a way, as the head of the Senate Committee on Tariffs, is the most important person in Washington. And so to break that whole direct election of senators is to force these people to kind of come out in the open. Is next week fall? Wait, when is fall break? I should know that, shouldn't I? Yeah, let's just do it packbacks as usual, if that's okay. Oh, I see. Yeah, let's just do it packback as usual Tuesdays and Thursdays, if that's okay. Let me talk about the bitter fruits, the last thing, the bitter fruits of the long progressive movement. When Wilson comes to power, remember that Wilson is a Democrat. Wilson comes from the South. Wilson is a progressive in these other ways, but he also believes more or less in segregation. And so segregation is imposed in Washington under Wilson's administration. Wilson's cabinet is composed primarily of Southerners. And there are about 50,000 African Americans who lose their jobs in the federal government in 1913. Basically, because the simple explanation for this is that the post office says, well, we can't segregate black and white people, so we have to fire all the black people because we can't make separate rooms for them. And so what we see in 1913 is lots and lots of federal employees who had been African American between 1883 and 1913 are basically ejected. So again, when we think about the progressive movement, there are some interesting things and important things about antitrust and about income taxes and about estate taxes and stuff like that that are crucial and probably on balance, you might agree with, you might agree or disagree, but anyways, they look left wing. But the progressives are not exactly left wing because the progressives are also responsible for segregation and the end of African Americans, not entirely, but largely as employees in the federal government. Okay, thanks so much, and see you guys on Wednesday.